Officials say there is nothing to worry about. No change in alert status. No sign of an eruption. Just business as usual at America's most dangerous volcano. But in the summer of 2025, something happened beneath Mount Rainier that had never been recorded before in the history of modern seismology. Starting in the early hours of July 8th, the ground beneath the mountain began to shake again and again until scientists had logged more than 1,000 separate earthquakes in a matter of weeks. It was, according to United States Geological Survey, the largest earthquake swarm ever measured at Rainier. And while the experts insist the volcano itself isn't stirring toward eruption, the swarm is a stark reminder of something far more urgent. Nearly 1 million people live in the direct path of a hazard that doesn't need lava or fire to kill. It just needs mud. Mount Rainier rises more than 14,000 feet above the Pacific Northwest, and on a clear day it dominates the horizon for anyone standing in Seattle, Tacoma, or even parts of southern British Columbia. For most of the people who live in its shadow, the mountain is scenery. It's the backdrop to a morning commute, a weekend hike, a photo from a waterfront park. Few of them stop to consider that they are looking at an active volcano, one of only 16 worldwide given the designation Decade Volcano because of its combination of eruptive history and its proximity to dense population centers. Underneath that peaceful white summit, the mountain is anything but calm. Hundreds of small earthquakes rattle through its interior every year, and hot, acidic fluids are slowly working their way through the rock, turning solid stone into a soft, clay-like material. At the same time, Rainier carries more glacial ice than any other volcano in the Cascade Range, a frozen reservoir sitting directly above hundreds of thousands of homes. That combination, a mountain riddled with weakened rock and buried under a mile-deep blanket of ice, is exactly why emergency planners in Washington state pay such close attention to what happens on Rainier slopes. More than 900,000 people currently live across Pierce, King, and Thurston counties in zones identified as being within reach of a major volcanic mudflow. Entire neighborhoods, schools, and shopping centers sit on ground that was laid down by identical events centuries ago. Interstate 5, freight rail lines, shipping ports, and hydroelectric dams worth billions of dollars all sit in the same low-lying river valleys that a future flow would follow. It is this quiet quality of the risk, the way it hides beneath ordinary suburban life, that makes Rainier such a difficult challenge to the people whose job is to protect the region. Long before European mapmakers ever saw the mountain, the indigenous nations of the Puget Sound region already understood its power. The Puyallup, Nisqually, Cowlitz, Yakama, and Muckleshoot peoples call the mountain Tahoma, Tacobet, or Takabwa, meaning roughly the mother waters. To these communities, the mountain was never just a landmark. Families traveled up into its high meadows each summer to gather berries and medicinal plants, while treating the icy summit itself as a sacred place that was best left alone. Tahoma also served as a natural compass, its snowy profile guiding trade routes between the inland Cascades and the shores of Puget Sound. Just as importantly, oral traditions passed down through generations describe a mountain that shook, spewed ash, and sent boiling mud pouring into the valleys below. One Puyallup account even describes a catastrophic collapse of the summit that triggered massive waves across nearby lakes, a story that closely mirrors what geologists would later confirm happened in the region's ancient past. Long before scientists began digging into layers of volcanic soil, native communities already carried the real history of the mountain's violent episodes. That history became far more complicated after 1854, when the Treaty of Medicine Creek forced local tribes to give up millions of acres of ancestral land surrounding Tahoma. Even so, the cultural connection to the mountain never disappeared. And in recent years, tribal nations have partnered with park officials and researchers, blending traditional ecological knowledge with modern volcano monitoring. The science behind why Rainier exists at all starts far offshore, where a slab of dense oceanic crust known as the Juan de Fuca Plate is slowly sliding beneath the lighter continental plate of North America. This process, unfolding along the Cascadia subduction zone, generates enormous heat and pressure as the plate creeps forward roughly an inch or two every year. That pressure melts rock deep underground, and the resulting magma works its way toward the surface through weaknesses in crust, fueling every volcano in the Cascade chain. Rainier sits directly above one of the more active points in that system. The mountain visible today began forming around 500,000 years ago, built up over thousands of individual eruptions on top of volcanic rock, nearly 40 million years old. Sometimes a mountain grew through slow-moving flows of thick lava. Other times it grew through violent explosive eruptions that scattered ash and rock across the landscape. During past ice ages, lava repeatedly met glacial ice head-on, cooling rapidly into the striking hexagonal rock columns still visible along several of the park's trails today. The tug-of-war between fire and ice also reshaped the terrain around the volcano in a phenomenon geologists call inverted topography. Ancient lava flows once filled glacially carved valleys and hardened into dense rock. When the glaciers eventually retreated, the softer surrounding rock eroded away far faster than the hardened lava, leaving what used to be valley floors standing above the newly worn-down landscape as ridges. Meanwhile, the upper portion of the mountain has changed dramatically over time. Geologists believe Rainier once stood over 15,000 feet tall before a series of eruptions and structural collapses removed a significant portion of its original summit. The twin craters and modern summit cones seen today formed within just the last 10,000 years, and the mountain's most recent major eruption occurred roughly 2,200 years ago, scattering ash and pumice across the region. The record makes clear that although Rainier appears dormant from the outside, its internal building process is far from finished. Nowhere is that more evident than in the layers of clay and buried forest that construction crews occasionally uncover beneath towns like Enumclaw and Auburn. Roughly 5,600 years ago, a massive section of Rainier's summit gave way in a single catastrophic failure known as the Osceola mudflow. Close to a cubic mile of rock and ice broke loose and thundered down the White River Valley, eventually traveling more than 60 miles to reach Puget Sound and burying over 200 square miles of land under deposits as much as 100 feet deep. The event stripped roughly 1,000 feet off the mountain summit and filled in ancient bays, creating the flat valley floors where several present-day Washington communities now sit. What makes the Osceola flow so significant to modern hazard planning is that it didn't require a violent eruption to happen. Superheated groundwater and steam had spent thousands of years quietly converting solid volcanic rock into weak, slippery clay, until the mountain's own weight caused a weakened slope to fail. A similar, smaller event, known as the electron mudflow, struck around the year 1500, when a section of the mountain's west flank collapsed without any obvious eruption trigger. A wall of mud roughly 100 feet high raced down the Puyallup River Valley and reached the site of what is now the town of Ording in under 30 minutes, burying entire forests so quickly that trees were found still standing upright within the deposit. Because that same kind of hydrothermally weakened rock remains locked inside the mountain today, scientists say a comparable flank failure could happen again with little to no warning. While mud flows have shaped the valleys below, an entirely different battle plays out at the summit, where Rainier's 28 named glaciers cover roughly 35 square miles and hold more ice than every other Cascade volcano combined. The Emmons Glacier, spreading across the mountain's eastern slope, is the largest glacier by surface area anywhere in the lower 48 states, while the Carbon Glacier on the northern face is the thickest glacier in the contiguous United States. These ice fields function as natural reservoirs for the entire region, feeding 5 major river systems that supply drinking water, hydroelectric power, farmland irrigation, and salmon habitat throughout the summer months. At the very top, heat escaping from the volcano slowly melts the underside of the summit ice cap, carving out networks of steam caves that early climbers once used for shelter. But that relationship between ice and heat is shifting. National Park Service monitoring shows Rainier's glaciers have lost more than a fifth of their total area since the late 1800s, and as the ice thins, it can trigger sudden glacial outburst floods or leave unsupported rock faces prone to collapse. Hazards park rangers now watch for regularly, particularly during warm summer afternoons. Humans have been drawn to this mountain and its dangers for more than 2 centuries. British naval officer George Vancouver spotted the peak from Puget Sound in 1792 and named it after his friend, Rear Admiral Peter Rainier. It would be almost 80 more years before anyone attempted to reach the top. In August 1870, Hazard Stevens and Philemon Van Trump, guided partway by a Nisqually man named Sluiskin, who warned them not to continue, became the first documented climbers to stand on the summit, surviving a freezing night sheltered near the volcano's steam vents. 20 years later, schoolteacher Faye Fuller became the first woman to complete the climb, proving that high-altitude mountaineering wasn't reserved for men. Around that same era, hopeful prospectors dug mining camps into mountains' flanks, searching for copper, silver, and coal, and while the mines mostly failed, entrepreneurs like James Longmire discovered there was more money to be made hosting travelers who wanted to soak in the area's natural mineral springs. As roads improved, Rainier became one of the premier training grounds in the country for high-altitude climbers preparing for expeditions to Alaska and the Himalayas, though that reputation came at a cost. More than 400 people have died on the mountain since records began, lost to crevasses, avalanches, and sudden storms. By the close of the 19th century, logging and mining interests were rapidly encroaching on the forests around the base of the mountain, prompting conservationists and outdoor groups like the Sierra Club and the Mountaineers to lobby for federal protection. Their campaign succeeded on March 2, 1899, when President William McKinley signed legislation establishing Mount Rainier as the country's 5th national park. Park designers responded with distinctive architectural style, using local timber and stone for structures that blended into the landscape, epitomized by the Paradise Inn, which opened in 1916 with hand-carved cedar beams and massive stone fireplaces. During the Great Depression, crews from the Civilian Conservation Corps built stone bridges, trails, fire lookout towers, and scenic mountain roads still in use today. The park now covers more than 236,000 acres and draws upward of 2 million visitors annually, a level of traffic that has forced the Park Service to experiment with different ways of managing crowds around popular areas like Paradise and Sunrise. For all the beauty that draws those visitors, emergency planners keep coming back to one uncomfortable fact. Rainier's greatest threat isn't a dramatic eruption. It's a lahar, the same volcanic mudflow that buried ancient forests thousands of years ago. These flows can travel at speeds up to 50 miles an hour, and towns like Ording, Sumner, and Puyallup sit directly in the river valleys they would follow, hemmed in by steep terrain that leaves few fast routes to higher ground. What makes lahars especially dangerous is that an eruption isn't required to trigger one. A rock slide on a slope weakened by internal heat and chemical alteration can set off the same kind of disaster without warning. Using fluid dynamics modeling software developed by the USGS, scientists estimate that a major mud flow could reach Ording in as little as 30 to 40 minutes and Puyallup less than an hour after that, a timeline that would also threaten to sever Interstate 5, disable rail lines, damage hydroelectric infrastructure, and shut down the Port Tacoma for months. Because the margin for warning is so thin, Rainier is now one of the most closely monitored volcanoes on the planet. The USGS Cascades Volcano Observatory, working alongside the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network, maintains a web of sensitive seismometers listening for the smallest tremors, GPS and satellite radar stations capable of detecting millimeter-scale swelling in the mountain slopes, and periodic gas sampling at summit vents to check for changes that might signal rising magma. Along river channels like Tahoma Creek, the Nisqually, and the Puyallup, solar-powered acoustic flow monitors listen for the distinct low-frequency rumble of mud and debris on the move, automatically triggering warning sirens in downstream communities if they detect it. In towns like Ording, that system is treated as a normal part of life, with school children regularly practicing evacuation drills that walk them out of their classrooms and up to designated high ground. All of that technology is exactly why the events of July 2025 mattered so much to scientists, even though the public alert level never moved. When the swarm began just after 1:30 in the morning on July 8, seismic stations across the mountains started registering earthquakes at a rate of more than 30 per hour. Within days, the Pacific Northwest Seismic Network had located over 1,000 individual events, with more too small to pinpoint precisely, making it the largest swarm ever documented at Rainier, surpassing even a notable cluster of quakes back in 2009. The strongest tremor recorded during the swarm barely reached a magnitude of 2.4, far too small to be felt by most people standing on the surface. Researchers monitoring gas emissions, ground deformation, and other volcanic indicators found nothing unusual accompanying the shaking, and the official hazard status for Rainier stayed at green, the lowest level on the scale, throughout the entire episode. Scientists attribute swarms like this one to fluids moving through cracks and fault lines deep inside the volcano, a process that happens periodically without leading to an eruption. By the end of July, The rate of earthquakes had dropped back down to just a handful of events a day. Still, an event of this size is a useful reminder of what volcanologists have been saying for years. Rainier doesn't need to erupt violently to be dangerous. The least severe scenarios researchers plan for involve small steam explosions confined largely to the summit area. A more significant event might resemble the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens, sending an ash column high into the atmosphere that could drift toward Seattle and Tacoma, depending on wind direction, potentially grounding flights and straining regional infrastructure. But the scenario that worries planners most is a sudden flank collapse, triggered not by an eruption at all, but by the same kind of hydrothermal weakening that produced the Osceola and electron mud flows centuries ago, sending a wall of mud into the Puyallup Valley in under an hour. And even as these risks remain well documented, Pierce, King, and Thurston counties continue to see rapid population growth, with new housing and commercial development pushing further into zones built on the deposits of past mud flows. Mount Rainier isn't going anywhere, and neither, it seems, are the hundreds of thousands of people who have chosen to build their lives in its shadow. The mountain's geologic record makes one thing clear: the calm visible from a distance is only ever temporary. So the question worth asking isn't whether Rainier will act again, but how prepared the region will be when it finally does. Should local governments be doing more to limit development inside known hazard zones? Or is that a decision that belongs to individual families weighing the risk for themselves? Let us know what you think in the comments. And if you want more deep dives into the natural forces shaping our world, don't forget to subscribe, and check out the next video on your screen.